Hi, I'm Tony Morbin, Executive News Editor with ISMG. Welcome to this discussion about leveraging cloud services to accelerate the CMMC compliance journey. The Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification is critical to national security and will create the foundation for everything contractors do every day. The requirements for CMMC are exacting and require a skilled and resource-heavy process. However, understanding and utilizing cloud services can make it less expensive, less risky, and faster to achieve compliance for defense industrial-based companies. To address the issues around leveraging cloud services to accelerate the CMMC compliance journey, I'm joined by subject matter experts, Stuart Itkin, Vice President, CMMC and FedRAMP Assurance, Coal-Fire Federal, and Tom Woolard, Senior Technical Program Manager on AWS's CMMC go-to-market team. Stuart, Tom, welcome.
Hi.
Thank you, Tony.
Good to see you. Now let's get straight into the basics of it. What is the Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification and why was it conceived? Stuart.
Yeah, well, CMMC, or Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification, it was established to create a minimum baseline or a threshold of cybersecurity that organizations entrusted by the DoD to handle sensitive defense information must be able to handle or must be able to satisfy. And the reason for this is that these are the organizations that are being targeted by adversaries. It's not the large prime contractors that have very sophisticated, mature defenses, but rather it's the smaller suppliers, 2, 3, sometimes 10, 12 levels down in the supply chain. And these attacks, unfortunately, have been successful and resulting in the loss of a substantial amount of sensitive information. The DoD estimates on the order of $600 billion a year. But this really translates into the narrowing of the technical advantage that our country has. It has an impact on our national security, the safety and the lethality of our warfighters. And these attacks have become very broad and very sophisticated, covering a number of different vectors. I mean, ranging anywhere from simple malicious code insertion to looking at things like identity theft, stealing credentials for login purposes. And as a consequence, the CMMC program, to be able to really address and provide this minimum threshold of security, is similarly needs to be fairly broad to be able to provide means of mitigating these types of attacks that we see. So CMMC incorporates both a range of technical controls, some of which are fairly sophisticated to be able to implement a series of physical controls that need to be implemented, as well as the need to be able to establish, maintain, and demonstrate compliance with a series of policies and procedures that, again, organizations need to have in place. And as you said in the introduction, these are very exacting and technical requirements. And when we look at some of these smaller and medium businesses within the defense industrial base, they really lack the wherewithal to be able to understand the compliance requirements or to have the technical resources. And if each and every one of them were to implement this on their own, certainly the cost becomes substantial for them. And this is really where cloud services represent an alternative to address some of those concerns or challenges that are facing these small and medium companies.
Sure, Stuart, we're going to get on to the challenges and how we face them. I'm just while we're on the basics, is there anything you wanted to add there, Tom?
Yeah, sure. I think before we get to the security of it, defense industrial-based customers that are subject to CMMC and DFARS 7012, they'll see the same benefits any company will by moving to the cloud. You can trade fixed expenses for variable expenses. You just pay for what you consume. You're not a big outlay for capital expenses. You can stop guessing about capacity. You can stop spending money maintaining and running data centers. Then you benefit from once in the cloud, you benefit from the massive economies of scale of the cloud, which allows you to increase the speed and agility that you roll out applications to your employees. And then when you roll those out, you can go global in minutes. So in general, a move to the cloud, generally you're going to see a cost saving. You're going to see an increase in your IT staff's productivity. You're going to see operational resilience increase, and you'll see an increase in business agility. The thing to remember, though, is the safeguarding of that CUI, it carries over to the cloud. but the DIB member is still gained there because you can benefit from the cloud security in place by the cloud service provider, providing that the cloud service provider has the adequate security as defined by DFARS and CMMC.
Mm-hmm. Okay, again, we're going to go into more depth on the cloud service providers, but Stuart, back to you again. You were talking about the exacting requirements. What exactly are the challenges that organizations face when it comes to satisfying CMMC requirements? Well,
first, and let me just kind of double click on a point that Tom made. I mean, the challenge with respect to third-party list or risk or the security of information entrusted with suppliers is not unique to the Department of Defense. It affects every government agency. It affects every commercial organization, and the benefits that cloud provide, not just from security but scalability, apply universally in that respect. More specifically, when we look at CMMC and the specific nature of these, again, it's a range of those because the attack surface is fairly large. But looking at things like needing to implement multi-factor authentication to guard access for every application which is in the CUI boundary or which may handle CUI, the enforcement of FIPS validated encryption to ensure that data in transit and data at rest are protected. And again, the list of these technical requirements go on. They also require a series of physical requirements to ensure that access to data resources are protected, access to where servers are, access to control maintaining and patching systems. And all of these represent not just one-time costs, but ongoing expenses to organizations that, again, can be challenging if they lack the IT resources and certainly are paying for all of that just on their own, rather than looking at it as a shared expense across a broader pool of organizations.
Mm-hmm. And Tom, from your perspective, what are the challenges you see?
Well, first I'll start with the requirements. So if you're a DIB member, you're going to the cloud. What DFARS 252.214.7012 requires, and what the CMMC assessment process reiterates, is that when you use a cloud service provider, the DIB contractor has to require and ensure that the cloud service provider has security in place that's equivalent to the federal and moderate baseline. So what is the federal and moderate baseline? Well, the OMB, Office of Management and Budget, created about 10 years ago as a cost-effective risk-based approach for the adoption and use of cloud by the federal government. So what, in CMMC purposes, they've baked that into the processing. If you're going to be protecting CUI, we want you to adhere to the same set of requirements that we've cooked up for the federal government. So the federal moderate baseline, it's 325 controls. They've been selected specifically by OMB to measure and evaluate and assess cloud service providers' ability to protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of CUI, controlled and classified information, once it's in the cloud. And if you think about it, so FedRAMP is your standard of the cloud, so the cloud service provider's physical, environmental, infrastructure security. But then NIST 800-171 is your standard for any workloads you put in the cloud, meaning the applications you use on a daily basis.
Okay, so we've talked there about some of the challenges related to cloud, but what about the benefits? I mean, you did mention scalability, but how and why does cloud represent a solution? Again, Tom.
Sure. In this context for security, especially, you can inherit a controls security inheritance from the cloud provider, meaning your onus, the responsibility is still on the DIB contractor. But by using a contract that has federal moderate baseline in place, better yet, maybe a FedRAMP authorized provider, you can inherit a lot of that security. So you benefit from using a cloud provider that's already been evaluated by the federal government, has that check in the block. And when you go through the assessment process, Stuart can speak this better than I can. The assessor will say, okay, using a moderate authorized, FedRAMP authorized provider, that's a pass for that section of whatever work, whatever data, whatever your CUI you've committed to the cloud.
Mm-hmm. And Stuart, anything you want to add on to that?
No, I think Tom's point is spot on. I mean, it's a matter of some of these requirements are inherited or come from the cloud service provider. So rather than an organization needing potentially to implement encryption, it kind of comes from the cloud service. It's part of the service that is provided, and then no longer the responsibility of the client or the customer in that case to be able to provide it. And it eliminates a very substantial cost that would exist if that client were to say, I'm going to implement this capability myself. So it's really in terms of taking the burden off of an organization, whether it's within the defense industrial base or otherwise, to need to have the wherewithal or the expertise to understand the compliance requirement, to understand the technical requirement, and not to have to bear the cost to be able to do that. To Tom's point, the DFARS 7012, which which is a requirement that affects all organizations within the defense industrial base that handle CUI, states that an organization that uses a cloud service within its environment to be able to store, process, or transmit CUI has the responsibility for ensuring that that cloud service meets the FedRAMP moderate baseline. And as Tom indicated, FedRAMP was established to ensure that cloud services used by the government establish or satisfy and maintain a threshold level of security to satisfy the sensitivity of government information that is being handled. Well, FedRAMP as a program, again, applies to cloud services the government is using, and many DIB organizations are using cloud services that may not being used by the government, and that hence are not eligible to go through the FedRAMP process, because FedRAMP does require a government agency sponsor. And in this case, the requirement for that DIB organization is to be able to demonstrate that that cloud service that they're using satisfies the FedRAMP moderate baseline. Now, again,
I was actually, Stuart, going to get on right now to asking you about those requirements that are actually placed on the cloud service providers rather than the requirements from the cloud service providers. So what are the requirements that are placed on cloud service providers that are within the CUI boundary of defense contractors? I know hopefully that's where you were going, but go ahead.
Well, it's really something that affects both cloud service providers that are contractors to the government, as well as to the large base of manufacturing and other organizations that are within the defense industrial base, and the requirement that exists for the cloud services that they are using is to be able to satisfy this FedRAMP moderate baseline. Again, if they're being used by the government and they've gone through the process of achieving or obtaining a FedRAMP ATO, then that certainly establishes that they've satisfied and that they're maintaining that level of security. But for those that aren't, the onus is on the OSC, or the organization that is seeking certification for CMMC, to be able to validate that that cloud service has in fact satisfied those requirements, and generally occurs by asking for a body of evidence. We as an authorized C3 PAO, kind of the bar that we've looked at and the bar that others is asking for those cloud services to provide objective evidence that would be similar to that of having gone through the FedRAMP process, to be able to provide evidence of a FedRAMP assessment conducted by a FedRAMP 3 PAO, to be able to provide the results of that assessment or a security assessment report, a SAR, and an opinion letter from that 3 PAO stating that upon conducting the assessment, it is their belief, their opinion, that that cloud service has satisfied the baseline. And it's, again, up to the organization to verify and obtain that evidence, and to be able to provide that evidence to the CMMC assessor.
Mm-hmm. Be quite interested to hear Tom's perspective on this. How do you see the requirements placed on the cloud service providers?
I think the important thing to begin with, it's a shared responsibility model. So it's never 100%. You're going to inherit the security from the cloud provider, but you also have to bear in mind the different consumption models. So there's infrastructure as a service. AWS has a variety of infrastructure as a service products. Then there's platform as a service, and say software as a service, like a Salesforce, where all you're really bringing is your web browser and your login information, right? In a software as a service model, you're probably inheriting very, in the high 90 percentile of those security controls. And then as it gets to platform infrastructure, there's going to be more that the customer is responsible for, or if they have a managed service provider, or some other helper in between there. So you've got to really consider the whole model and not just assume, oh, I'm going to go to the cloud and they're FedRAMP authorized, I'm good to go. It's not the case, because there's always going to be a customer responsibility. So what I would suggest is you want to see in writing a customer responsibility matrix. This is what CMMC advises, well, from that cloud provider. So like on a security control by security control detail, what the service provider is responsible for solely, what the customer is responsible for solely, and what's a shared responsibility. And that shared responsibility is really where you have to dig in and make sure that the provider's doing what their piece is, and you as the DIB member are accomplishing yours. And it gets further complicated sometimes in the CMMC world, where if it's a customer responsibility, it's a FedRAMP control, it's a customer responsibility, and that responsibility maps to an 800-171 control. They want to see that spelled out specifically. So with stored contest better than it gets very specific. So it's an easy button for a lot of reasons to go to the cloud, but as long as it's backed up by customer compliance guys and customer responsibility matrices and all the FedRAMP documentation, you can put your store together.
Understand your responsibility, monitor it, and make sure that you stay in compliance. Now, right. Stuart already said the onus is on the OSC. So what's the litmus test for having achieved FedRAMP moderate equivalency or satisfying the requirements of the FedRAMP moderate baseline?
Well, again, it's if the cloud service that is being used has gone through the FedRAMP process and has an ATO or an authority to operate, that provides an ample body of evidence to demonstrate that, in fact, it is FedRAMP equivalent because it's gone through that. For cloud services that haven't gone through the process, it's being able to provide a similar body of evidence that would have been created as part of the FedRAMP process, and being able to demonstrate that it was credibly performed and that, in fact, it has satisfied that. So the onus is on the organization that is being assessed to demonstrate and to prove a cloud service does satisfy those requirements. And in addition to asking for that body of evidence, as Tom indicated, they also need to ask for the customer responsibility matrix. What are those controls or requirements that are fully satisfied by the cloud service? Which are those that have a shared responsibility, something that is provided by the cloud service, but something yet that the organization needs to do to complete the satisfaction of that requirement, and some that the organization that is being assessed for CMMC needs to satisfy solely by itself.
Tom, anything you want to add before we get to our summing up?
Yeah, sure. Two things. One is the FedRAMP.gov has a ton of information. To Stuart's point, you can go to the FedRAMP.gov site. They have a marketplace of authorized providers, and you can find your cloud service provider on that list if they're on there. Or if not, and you want to build a body of evidence, what the DoD tells you to do is use those FedRAMP.gov resources, the security audit report, the control implementation summary, all that documentation that a FedRAMP authorized provider would have to provide. It's listed there, and you can have, so if you have a provider you want to use and they're not on the authorized list, you can certainly say, well, here's the FedRAMP body of evidence we need, but those resources are available on the .gov site.
Okay, so now we're going to have to close it now, but just a last word. What advice would you have for defence contractors? Words of wisdom now. Tom, then Stuart.
I think we've made the point that that adopting cloud, leveraging cloud service providers can help organizations substantially reduce the cost, the time, the risk of being able to satisfy CMMC. But it's ensuring that they select a cloud service provider wisely. A number that are broadly used, a number that are used by government, but other cloud services and small cloud services that we've seen organizations look at. FedRAMP is a commitment. It's not a point in time where I demonstrate I've satisfied it. FedRAMP requires not only demonstrating, but continuously maintaining that level of security as a cloud service provider. So, so certainly in selecting a cloud service provider, ensure that it's somebody that has the commitment, not just to having satisfied this one time, but continuing to ensure that they're maintaining the security requirements that are required. And finally, that if you're looking for a cloud service provider, ask them who else is using that cloud service to be able to satisfy CMMC requirements. And if you're the Lone Ranger, you may want to consider other alternatives.
Mm-hmm. Tom, I can imagine you echoing a lot of that, but what are your own final words?
I would say to Stuart's point, we talked a lot about cloud service providers throughout this entire time. It's really cloud service offerings that get authorized, not the provider. So when you get onto that FedRAMP list of providers, make sure the offering that you're choosing is FedRAMP authorized. That you have the right documentation, and you can verify that through the customer responsibility matrices and what's on the FedRAMP list of authorized providers. But make sure that the offering you're choosing is in fact have a FedRAMP authorization.
Stuart, Tom, you did a great job of squeezing an awful lot into a very short space of time. Thanks for sharing your insight and expertise today. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you've learned something new about leveraging cloud services to accelerate the CMMC compliance journey. For ISMG, I'm Tony Morbin.